Looking at the latter half of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, a lot of veteran FNAF fans look at things like Glamrock Freddy or The Mimic or even The Tangle and just go, "How did I get here?" After all, there's a percentage of FNAF fans out there that just accepted the story ended at Ultimate Custom Night 6 years ago. Meanwhile, there's been 6 years of video games since, I think 4 or 5 in total. But what did happen? What got us from there to here? Well, today I'm going to try to bridge that gap. I believe that Freddy Fazbear Pizzaria Simulator, or FNAF 6, isn't an ending, but instead a transition to the latter half of the franchise. And I genuinely think the answers we're given in that game and others give us some pretty strong inclinations as to what happened between them, telling us how we went from the fire that ended it all to the villain that just won't die. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. But before we can solve FNAF 6 and the whole FNAF timeline, we need to know what's actually happening in Freddy Fazbear Pizzaria Simulator, at least as is directly told to us in-game and with associated books. So, what did happen? Well, between the file name HRY, the fact that in the Silver Eyes he helped create the franchise, and the fact that he has a daughter killed by William Afton, I feel it's safe to assume that Henry is the one behind Freddy Fazbear Pizzaria Simulator. I'm just gonna call it FNAF 6. If I say Freddy Fazbear Pizzaria Simulator one more time, I'm going to go crazy. Henry Emily from the Silver Eyes is co-owner and creator of Fazbear with William Afton, and it was Henry's expertise that helped to create the animatronics, an expertise that we see in full bloom in this game. Henry wants to end all of this, the suffering that he feels partly responsible for and the man behind the slaughter. So he creates the Pizzaria Simulator, a building meant to put up the facade of a Freddy's Pizza to lure in all of the remaining players in the timeline. But is it a real location? Like, do kids come here and play during the day and then we do stuff at night? That is kind of up for debate. On one hand, when we see the main map of the area in the final monologue, the center room where the pizzeria would be fades away. And also, Henry states that the maze is filled with sounds and sights and smells and misdirection. So the sounds we hear during the day shift of kids playing could be those sounds Henry is talking about. And I mean, surely Henry wouldn't lure several animatronics with a history of killing children to a building children are in, right? Right? Well, on the other hand, you do have to make money in order to get things done. And sure, all of the money could theoretically be given by Henry to keep up the facade to the player, but you could also get sued if you have too much liability and or go bankrupt. And I know Henry is trying to keep up appearances here, but dooming his plan to bankruptcy because his volunteer didn't play pretend good enough seems like a step too far. Not to mention, we do physically see this room in Security Breach, implying that it is a real room. So it does seem like there's an actual functioning pizzeria at this location, probably on the ground floor, and then much lower underneath is where we are. Using this pizzeria, Henry is able to lure in Scrap Baby, Molten Freddy, Lefty, William Afton, and a helpful volunteer. William Afton looks like this in his current state after the fire of FNAF 3 and possible other in-between game shenanigans, leading most players to call him Scrap Trap. Scrap Baby and Molten Freddy are the aftermath of Ennard. With teasers from the Scott Games websites, we know that Ennard left Michael's body, and then the inner pieces of Ennard started fighting with each other until eventually Circus Baby was kicked out from the group. So it's assumed that the rest of Ennard formed into Molten Freddy, and Circus Baby formed into Scrap Baby. However, the souls within Molten Freddy are up for debate. Some people believe it to be the victims of the Funtime animatronics, others posit that it could be the Crying Child. But I do think the most likely option is that it is part of the Missing Child incident souls. If you want me to go more in depth and show more evidence for that, I did just recently make a pretty big video on it right here, but for the sake of time, just that's what I believe. Lefty is actually a new animatronic, presumably built by Henry to capture the marionette. So again, another player in the timeline, but one that wouldn't come willingly. And finally, Henry's volunteer, the player, is also up for debate, although much less so than Molten Freddy. I and many others believe it's most likely Michael Afton. For one, it fits thematically that Michael would be one of the main protagonists of the series and help end it all. And not to mention specifically this line.
And to you, my brave volunteer, who somehow found this job listing not intended for you. Although there was a way out planned for you, I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling that you are right where you want to be. I am remaining as well.
If this is Michael Afton, and he knows William Afton is in the building, it would make sense that he would also want to die here so he can finally rest as well. Now, some people think the first part of this line implies that we're not playing as Michael Afton, but instead some random person. After all, the line says this wasn't intended for them. But I argue the opposite. I believe that Henry intended this volunteer job to be for some random person. That's why he planned an escape route. He didn't intend for Michael Afton to show up because, as far as he's aware, Michael Afton should be dead. If anything, he's probably surprised Michael Afton is still around, and that's why the job wasn't intended for him. I mean, hell, even Mike thinks he's supposed to be dead.
I should be dead, but I'm not.
Once everyone is in the building, Henry burns everything to the ground in an attempt to have everyone find peace or rest, and/or William Afton burn in hell forever. Something worth noting, however, we do once again see this room in security breach, and it looks mostly unburnt. So it seems likely that the maze was burnt, whereas the actual pizzeria section was left relatively unharmed. Maybe that's what caused the sinkhole. It was burned so much that the structural integrity fell, and the whole building sunk down, mostly intact. So why isn't this the end of the story? Everyone is trapped in a metal locked maze and burnt to ash. It seems pretty final. Well, in Security Breach and its free DLC Ruin, we can travel to this building, and there are still animatronics inside. So did nothing work? Was Henry's plan entirely for naught? Let's build out our timeline of events after the FNAF 6 fire and see if we can make our way to Security Breach to figure that out. Immediately after FNAF 6, it's basically confirmed. Not directly confirmed, but incredibly evidentiarily solid that Ultimate Custom Night takes place. A never-ending torment of William Afton using his own agony and memories by the vengeful spirit. We're nearly certain of this thanks to a few things. From the games, we have a lot of death quotes that allude to the fact we're playing as William Afton.
I am a burning reminder of your misdeeds.
I am your wickedness, made of flesh. I am the fearful reflection of what you have created.
And that someone is keeping us here even though they tried to burn us.
Greetings from the fire, and from the one you should not have killed.
He tried to release you. He tried to release us. But I'm not gonna let that happen. I will hold you here. I will keep you here. No matter how many times they burn us.
That, paired with the story The Man in Room 1280, makes this fairly straightforward. Well, what is The Man in Room 1280? Well, I'll be incredibly brief. It's a Fazbear Frights story. Here's a quick summary. Essentially, William Afton should be dead, but instead he's an incredibly burnt corpse that's somehow barely alive with semi-translucent skin in a hospital. The nurses and doctors there have even tried to put him down to put him out of his misery, but he just won't die. Not only that, but a spirit of a boy with curly hair and an alligator mask keeps chasing them off. Later in the story, we find out that there are two consciousnesses within his mind. In another story, we learn that that other consciousness is that boy named Andrew. I was being quick about it. In another story, we learn that that consciousness was a boy named Andrew, and he doesn't remember why, but he knows that he hated William so much that he wanted to keep him alive as long as possible to torture him with his own mind. Does this sound familiar? This process is likely what we're seeing in Ultimate Custom Night. William Afton being kept alive by a vengeful spirit to torture him forever for what he's done. How is that possible? Well, again, we have a pretty good idea on this because of Fazbear Frights. Essentially, it's likely that it's done through agony. Frankly, we do not have time to go into the differences of Remnant and agony in this video. But again, lucky for you, I did an entire video on it, a couple of them, but the main one is right here. For now, if you don't want to watch that, just take my word that Remnant is the mixture of soul or positive memory and emotion and metal, whereas agony is specifically the energy associated with the most negative form of human emotion, agony. This energy, like Remnant, is able to possess objects and manifest in different ways. But we see in the Fazbear Frights stories that it's also able to affect memories. An example of this in the epilogues, Eleanor, a character that I don't have time to get into, traps a detective in his own mind with her own memories and his, torturing him with them. All this to say, at the FNAF 6 location, there's definitely a lot of Remnant. However, if the blueprint hypothesis by William Afton is true, then excessive heat can neutralize Remnant. That being said, we don't know what neutralizes agony, so it's possible that heat doesn't. In other words, there's a very high possibility that the FNAF 6 fire did burn away all of the remaining remnant of the series, but left a massive pile of agony with melted animatronics all over. And that sounds like a perfect place for William Afton to be forever tormented in his own mind. Not to mention, if what I believe is true, then the other remaining souls at the location find peace with FNAF World around the same time. It's a nice, neat bow on the end of the story. William Afton is stuck in this burnt basement, forever reliving his worst memories, and all the other souls move on. So why is it not the end of the story? Well, that depends on what you believe. What we're about to talk about, I think, is possibly the biggest debate in the Five Nights at Freddy's fandom. Do you believe that the Fazbear Frights stories, notably the epilogues and associated stories with them, are within the same continuity of the games? If you do believe in that, then that's the rest of this video. The stories of those books tell us what happens after FNAF 6. And to be fair, there's good merit to that argument. After all, Into the Pit, one of those stories, is being made into a game and has a subsequent Choose Your Own Adventure book coming out later this year, which is great evidence for the books that go along with that game to be brought into the game continuity very clearly. There is, in my opinion, one major problem with this thinking though, and the theory that the Fazbear Frights books are directly tied to the game's continuity, and that is Burntrap being William Afton. This guy in the security breach basement. If you believe that the Fazbear Frights stories are in continuity, this cannot be William Afton. You need to find someone else for this to be. In the Fazbear Frights stories, The Man in Room 1280, that story ends with William Afton's body exploding onto several other pieces of Fazbear merchandise and technology, infecting all of them with his agony. And then the rest of the stories in the epilogues are dealing with those possessed infected items, until eventually they all conglomerate into one massive amalgamation and are shoved into a lake, and the puppet makes it rip itself apart and die. So William Afton's body is goop that possessed things and is at the bottom of a lake, torn apart. Not here. And sure, that could have happened in the games, but that would require that Henry's fire was found by paramedics and they were able to retrieve Scraptrap, and somehow, this is one of my big sticking points, the Man in Room 1280 has no animatronic parts on him. He's just the burnt corpse. So somehow they would have had to get him out of the Spring Bonnie suit. I guess you could say that the Spring Bonnie suit fully melted off of him, but then, like, I don't know, that seems weird. So I don't know. I think that's definitely a possibility, and I understand that line of thinking. But if you think that, then this cannot be William Afton. William Afton is gone for good if that's the case. So you have to find another explanation for this creature. And there are other explanations, especially since Into the Pit is coming out. I think it's a perfectly valid theory to think that this is an agony manifestation. Think about the fact that Into the Pit is being turned into a full game. Into the Pit features Pit Bonnie, a agony manifestation. It's an empty Spring Bonnie suit that somehow turns into this weird organic flesh-like creature. I see it. You know, like, this matches that description in a way, this weird organic manifestation. And there are other explanations too. I know some people think this is the Mimic with a body affixed to it. There are a lot of different ways to explain this creature. But if you, like me, think that this is William Afton because he was burnt in a basement, and then when you go to that basement, you find this burnt corpse, which I think is pretty straightforward. If this is William Afton, Fazbear Frights cannot be within the game's continuity. And if so, what happens after FNAF 6? Well, we'll have to work backwards. We know that Glamrock Freddy digs down to FNAF 6 under the command of Vanny, meaning Vanny was already in existence before anything from that basement was recovered or retrieved. So that means, in Help Wanted, whatever turned Vanessa into Vanny, Glitchtrap, cannot be from technology from the FNAF 6 area. Are you following me? I'm going over a couple different games right now. In Help Wanted, Glitchtrap is formed from scanning in old technology produced by Fazbear, and whatever technology that is can't be FNAF 6 because FNAF 6 was uncovered by Vanny, who was already turned by Glitchtrap. So what technology was scanned to create this anomaly? Well, we're not sure exactly, but I think it's likely that it's something with the Mimic 1 program on it. After all, Fazbear said the technology scanned in was meant to assist in pathing and coding, and the Mimic 1 program program was used by Fazbear to make it easier to program animatronics. Not to mention the many qualities of Glitchtrap that are similar to a Mimic program, which I've gone over several times on this channel. But if that all is the case, and Glitchtrap is the Mimic 1 program, what was the goal of sending Vanny to the FNAF 6 pizzeria? Well, if Glitchtrap is the Mimic 1 program, it's entirely possible that Burntrap wasn't Plan A. In Ruin, the free DLC to Security Breach, we learn that the Mimic, an endoskeleton dating from way back in the beginning of the franchise, is trapped in the basement of the FNAF 6 pizzeria. And from the context clues of the area, it's likely that Gregory and Vanessa trapped him down there, most likely while they were under the control of Glitchtrap. And according to Gregory from Ruin, the Mimic has been down there for a really long time, but they're not quite sure what it is. I should be clear here, because some of you might be getting lost. The Mimic and the Mimic 1 program are two separate things. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, we learn that the Mimic is an endoskeleton with the Mimic 1 program inside of it, whereas the Mimic 1 program is just the coding that allows the Mimic to do what it does. The Mimic 1 program being something that will see something and replicate it. The main point of this program is to copy what it sees. Because of that, when I say Glitchtrap or the Mimic 1 program, I'm talking about the version of the Mimic 1 program that was uploaded to Help Wanted and saw and trained itself on everything inside of Help Wanted, a recreation of Fazbear's worst moments, whereas the Mimic is an endoskeleton whose history is somewhat unclear. If you believe that Tales from the Pizzaplex are fully within continuity, like Fazbear Frights, then we have a more direct answer for what the Mimic is. It's an endoskeleton created by Edwin Murray. It then took on the role of a babysitter for his son David, but then David died, and then it was abused by Edwin, and then left to rot, and then started killing people, and then it was brought to the Pizzaplex, and then started killing more people, and then it was disabled and put in a springlock suit. It's a lot. But if you don't believe that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are within the game's continuity, then it's unclear who made the Mimic. Possibly Henry, because that would make sense since he's kind of like the tech whiz, but we don't really have any leads on that. Regardless, if Glitchtrap was trying to come into the real world, which it seems like that's the plan with Help Wanted and how it treats Vanessa and Jeremy and Gregory and all them, then the Mimic would be a perfect vessel in its eyes. It's literally an endoskeleton already programmed to house its programming. It just needs to be re-uploaded with its new trained data. That vessel, the Mimic, was possibly Glitchtrap's first target in going down there. It may have known that the Mimic endoskeleton was trapped and contained within the FNAF 6 pizzeria. But then Vanny and Glamrock Freddy get down there and they find this burnt mass of wires and animatronics coated in this black viscous liquid. And in the center of it, William Afton's burnt corpse still in one piece. Suddenly, a way better vessel is found. If Glitchtrap is trying to recreate William Afton's deeds, who better to do it in than William Afton's body? So they lock the Mimic in the basement and get to work on repairing William Afton. However, once they take him out of that pile of agony, it forms its own body and tries to seek out William Afton and put him right back into Ultimate Custom Night. And thus, the beginning of Security Breach. I know I skipped over some details like where Gregory comes from and more in-depth things that happen with Help Wanted, but I've talked about that previously, and I think I'll save more in-depth stuff for that for the final timeline. This was more so how we get from FNAF 6 to Security Breach. And I think that makes sense, right? Especially with the idea that Henry's fire was never discovered by paramedics or firefighters. It was likely self-contained and then the whole building collapsed and Fazbear just paved over it to prevent any liability. Kind of like how they did with every back room when corpses were found in there. It's pretty on brand for Fazbear to just pave over liability. This, I think, is the most logical and evidentiarily backed pathway from FNAF 6 to Security Breach. But what do you think? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. In the meantime, if you want a more brainstorm and free-flowing discussion on this, I actually have a full podcast episode, which I have a podcast, by the way, about FNAF 6 and the fire and who survived, and you can watch it right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with #RightTart. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.